ציון תמלא, נשמה של שיר חדש, Hi everybody, Shalom, thank you for coming. And again, our dedications are, as always, praying for the victory of our soldiers in all the fronts of the war, the lasting unity of the people of Israel, and for all of those whose health has been affected by the war, the safe return of all of the hostages, and an Aliyat Neshamot for the memory of Jeremy Bernstein's late father's yard site today, the 9th of Elul, Baruch ben Shmuel Pinchas. May the Torah have an Aliyat Neshamot, and for Moshe Shimon ben Dov Berish, whose yard site is the 15th of Elul by his family. Again, may the Neshamas have an Aliyah in the merit of the Torah learning that we're doing tonight. This Parsha, Teitzei, is actually a very, very unique Parsha in terms of mitzvot. It has over 70 mitzvot. If you think about it, this is by far the largest number of mitzvot in a single Parsha. All sorts of mitzvot. Yibum and gets, many, many different things. And tzitzis, shatnez, many of the laws about mamzer, you're not allowed to marry a mamzer, etc., someone that's generated from adultery or incest. Many, many, many mitzvos. We obviously are not able to cover that many of them. But I want to start, I'm going to start a little out of order because I first want to share a vort from the second part of the Parsha, then I'm going to go backwards to the first part of the Parsha. If you remember, the second part of the Parsha, or the second mitzvah in the Parsha, discusses a situation if a man has two wives, because polygamy used to be permitted. A man has two wives, and it mentions ha'achas ahuva v'achas senua. One wife is beloved, and one wife he doesn't like so much. V'yoldu lo banim ha'ahuva v'asnua, and it mentions that each wife has given birth to a child, but the bechor, the firstborn child, is lasniya, is to the wife he does not like. So obviously he would prefer that his inheritance should go to the son of the wife that he likes and not to the son of the wife that he doesn't like. And the Torah's rule is that the laws of Yerusha must be followed, and therefore even though, right, a bechor gets a double portion, right, a firstborn child of the father gets a double portion in the inheritance of the father. So the Torah's chiddush is that even if the bechor is from the wife that is senua, nevertheless that child does get the pi shnayim. In fact, even if he divorced the woman, the bechor would get the pi shnayim, right? Lo yuchal bakar. Now, we're not going to discuss halachically how does one, because after all, there's all sorts of Yerusha problems. A bechor gets a double portion. Sons inherit everything when there are daughters. I'm sorry. Well, in other words, sons inherit even if there are daughters, right? Daughters only inherit if there are no sons at all. Obviously, many people, rightfully so in some ways, want to create a will, some type of document, some type of tahalich, some type of procedure that will allow the distribution of their estate in a manner that is different than the order of Yerusha. And the question is, halachically, how do you do that? Because let me just point out, if you simply made a will that is a secular will, and under the laws of either the United States or Great Britain or England or even the state of Israel, it is a valid will. But if it's taking things away from the yorshim of the Torah, it would be an act of theft. It would be an act of gezela. So as a result, when you do a will, which of course one should do, one also has to be sure that halachically they have effected conveyances of property in a manner that would be halachically effective. So Baruch Hashem, we have one of the great experts here, Teitzei. That's Teitzei's big field. So if anyone needs to do a halachic will, I recommend that you contact her. But that is not our subject for tonight. The Torah basically says, in the absence of these mechanisms, the bechor does have to get a double portion, even though he is from the ben hasnua. Now, it's very, very interesting that in the time of the Vilna Gaon, a very practical shaila came up that a man divorced a wife while she was pregnant. Not the nicest thing to do, but he divorced his wife while she was pregnant. He then married a second woman, and the second woman had a premature baby after 7 months of pregnancy. In other words, the second wife had a child before the earlier wife had a child. Okay, in other words, even though the first wife was pregnant first, it was the second wife that gave birth after 7 months, and the first wife gave birth after 9 months. So the question that was brought to the Vilna Gaon was, who is considered to be the Bechor with respect to inheritance? Is Bechor defined as first to be conceived, or is Bechor defined as the first to be born? Which one gets it? So the Vilna Gaon actually wants to bring a raya from this Parsha. And if you look at the wording very carefully, you see a certain anomaly. It says, a man has 2 wives, one is beloved, one is hated. And then it says, the Ben HaBechor is to the hated wife, so to speak, and therefore he gets the Pi Shnayim. Now, note that it starts off, he marries Ahuva v'Hasnua, v'yoldu lo banim, ho Ahuva v'Hasnua. So in terms of the sequence, it seems to say that the Ahuva gave birth first. V'yoldu lo banim, ho Ahuva v'Hasnua. But then it says, the Ben HaBechor is Lasnua. How do you understand it? So the Vilna Gaon says, the Torah is actually talking about this very case. A man has 2 wives, one he loves, one he hates. He divorces the hated wife while she is pregnant. The Ahuva gives birth first after 7 months, right? So what does the Torah say? That even though, I'm sorry. It's the other way around. Haya ben habachar lasniya, meaning the yoldu lo banim ahuva hasnua. Yoldu lo banim, meaning the Ahuva gave birth first. And yet the Bechor is Lasniya because it was the first to be conceived. So the Vilna Gaon says, if you read the Psukim carefully, you actually see that the entitlement of Pi Shnayim is based on conception rather than birth, because that's actually the case. He divorced the Snua while she was pregnant. The Ahuva gave birth first, but the Bechor is still called the Ben HaSnua. So the Gemara says, we therefore follow conception and not birth, and therefore the first to be conceived would be the Bechor for Pi Shnayim. Now this is a vort that is said in the name of the Vilna Gaon. We don't have the actual words of the Vilna Gaon, but as much of the Vilna Gaon's Torah, particularly on Chumash, these were oral teachings that were written down and transmitted by various students. So for example, if you look at the Vilna Gaon's collection on Chumash called the Kol Elio, and there's another one called the Divrei Elio. It is not the actual words of the Vilna Gaon. And the Nitziv of Volozhin, who the Nitziv married Rav Chaim of Volozhiner's granddaughter, so the Nitziv was very connected to the traditions in the yeshiva of the Gra, said it is impossible that this halacha could possibly be true. The Nitziv says it is a davar pashut ma'ot, that the status of Bechor does not depend on conception. The status of Bechor depends on birth, and the Nitziv doesn't offer an interpretation of the Psukim, but the Nitziv said, whoever understood the Vilna Gaon, that he would give Pi Shnayim to the first to be conceived, didn't understand him, must have made a mistake in what he heard. So it's very interesting. On one hand, we have a direct teaching of the Vilna Gaon, or at least in the name of the Vilna Gaon. On the other hand, we have the Nitziv, who says it's a davar pashut, that the teaching is incorrect. Now let me point out that this can exist apart from the issue of divorce or polygamy. Right? In the Torah's time it was polygamy, today it would be divorce. This can exist in modern fertility technologies, when you have frozen embryos. Right? Because frozen embryos, you can have frozen embryos that were conceived at different times. meaning the eggs were fertilized at different times. But let's say, for whatever reason, an egg that was fertilized later was implanted first and was born before the egg that was fertilized earlier, you'd have the identical question, who would be the Bechor for purposes of Pi Shnayim. According to the teaching of the Vilna Gaon, it would be the embryo that was first fertilized. According to the Nitziv, it would be the embryo that was carried to term and was born first. So again, it's an interesting how this old shaila of the Vilna Gaon could actually be a contemporary debate in fertility technology. Lamaisa, it's brought down lahalacha, I'll just mention, that even if you have a halachic will and you're not following the order of Yerusha, you're following a different order, it does say that a portion of the estate, even a small portion, should be distributed in accordance with the laws of Yerusha. So even if you're not planning on the firstborn son getting a double portion legamre, they still should get a double portion in something. For example, many poskim recommend that Sifrei Kodesh, the Sfarim library, should be distributed in accordance with the laws of Yerusha or anything, even if it's a small amount of money. So theoretically, this shaila might be relevant even today. Yeah.
I also think it's important to say double portion of what? Of mukzak, not ra'oi. That's a very big distinction. In other words, actual, let's say someone has in the bank account.
Yeah.
As opposed to an investment portfolio that goes up and down.
Yeah, that is important. I mean, the laws of Pi Shnayim, like all halachas of Yerusha, like all halachas generally, can be quite complicated. And the entitlement of the Bechor to a double portion does not refer to all assets that the father had when he died. It only refers to assets which were clearly in his possession, like cash, tangible property, or even bank accounts, which are considered to be accessible and withdrawable. But things like after acquired debts that come in, collection of debts, or the like, even though they can become part of an estate to be divided among the Yorshim, but the Bechor does not have Pi Shnayim. Now, it is a little tricky. Again, I don't want to get into technicalities. I mean, let's say, for example, that a person dies and leaves over an apartment building for which he collects rent. So the question becomes, the building is physically here. The building is physically here and physically owned. On the other hand, the rentals refer to amounts of money that accrue later. Is the Bechor entitled? Let's assume they're just two brothers. Right? If there are two brothers, Pi Shnayim is relatively simple. The Bechor simply gets 2/3, and the other brother gets 1/3. Does he get 2/3 of the rental? Do I look at the rental as a future asset that accrues? Or do I say that it is a consequence of ownership of the building? That if the Bechor gets 2/3 of the building, Mimela, automatically, he's going to get 2/3 of the rental. So again, ask your local rabbi if you have those types of questions. But yeah, that is an important distinction in the laws of Pi Shnayim itself. But the reason I brought it up is because I wanted to highlight the apparent chiddush of the Gra, that Pi Shnayim is based on time of conception, with the Nitziv's observation that he says that's impossible, and the Vilna Gaon never said such a thing.
So how do we hold?
Well, lahalacha we actually hold of the Nitziv. We actually do follow birth rather than conception, even though the Vilna Gaon had very interesting diyukim in the psukim itself. But now I want to go backwards a little bit to the very first mitzvah of the Parsha, which is one of the most ethically challenging mitzvos in the Torah. In fact, there's actually a recently published book in English on this, written by a professor at, I think at Bar Ilan University. In fact, I even gave him a blurb on it. What did he do here? He said, in honor of the Parsha, he published a bookmark with my haskama on it. Anyway, whatever. But it's a good book who analyzes the theme. It's a little academic, so I was a little worried about giving a haskama for it. But as I say, in my circles, they're not going to see the book anyway. So, so I think I'm okay. I'm okay here. But anyway, this is the woman that's a captive in war. Right? The Torah says that when you wage war against your enemy, and God will deliver your enemy to you, and you see in captivity, it's a non-Jewish woman, right, obviously, a non-Jewish beautiful woman, and speaking to the man, and the Jewish soldier desires her, and he takes her. So the Torah gives a whole procedure. It does allow, the way Rashi understands the sugya, it does allow, so to speak, one bite at the apple, meaning he can actually have intercourse with her. But if he then wants to keep her as a wife, after he has his initial intercourse, there's a whole ceremony which essentially is designed to make her unattractive to him. She cuts her, it's machlokas, she either lets her fingernails grow, she shaves her head, she wears rags, and she stays in his house for 30 days as she cries and mourns her father and mother. And if after that time the man wants to marry her, she becomes his wife. But if not, he is not allowed to keep her as a slave. Meaning, because he abused her in that way, she must be set free. She must be allowed to go back to her people. Unlike regular prisoners of war that can indeed be slaves, this woman for which there had been intercourse, the only choice is to marry her or set her free. She cannot remain in a condition of servitude. Now, this is filled with all sorts of difficulties. First of all, is the Torah legitimating rape during time of war? I mean, is the Torah saying, at least the first time, you can rape her as long as you're committed to either marrying her or setting her free, but the first time is a freebie? Well, as you know, wartime rape during time of war, is actually a war crime under modern international law, and we normally consider that to be, unfortunately, it's relatively common, Baruch Hashem, not in the Jewish armies, but in many other armies, it has happened. Is that what the Torah is legitimating? That's very, very difficult to understand. Number two, she's a non-Jewish woman. Number three, even if you go through the protocol of marriage, did she consent? Are we talking about, let's assume the best case scenario. Yes, I'm committed to marrying her and giving her a good life. What does she say about it? And does she remain a guy? Is the Torah allowing you to live with the guy? Or is the Torah talking about a conversion? And is the conversion volitional, that she agrees? Or is this a forced conversion? So there's a gazillion different types of problems that this raises. Let me just mention one thing about the wartime rape that is very, very important. And this is a comment of the Tosfos Rid. The Rid, Rabbi Yeshaya Detrani, was an Italian Rishon who was actually a very creative and independent thinker who wrote many Svarim on the Gemara and even on Tanakh. And the Rid actually says that even though Eshet Shafas Toar is a Chiddush because she's non-Jewish and hasn't been converted yet, any intercourse between them must be volitional. She must agree to it. So we're not talking about rape. He takes rape out of the Parsha here, and we're dealing with consent, even though it's still a Chiddush that the Torah matirs certain things in time of war because of the passion, but nevertheless it has to be a consensual relationship. And similarly, her conversion must be consensual, the marriage must be consensual. So if she does not agree to any of these conditions, she essentially will be freed, will be sent home, cannot be kept as a slave. Now still, even if we factor out coercion, we take out coercion from the equation, which I think ethically makes it much easier, you still understand what an extraordinary set of rules this is. The first intercourse, she's a guy, etc. And normally, we don't allow that type of relationship. But as Rashi explains, based on Chazal, Dibra Torah Keneged Yetzer Hara, the Torah is giving a concession to the Yetzer Hara, and that is the passions in time of war are so powerful that if God were not to allow this, it might be done in coercive, abusive ways. The Torah created kind of an avenue where you can do it. On the other hand, the Torah discourages the marriage by making her look unattractive, but at the end of the day, by giving a permissible route for this type of relationship, it is an outlet for passions in time of war. Still, that's very, very extraordinary, because our normal response is, if a person has a Yetzer Hara, they should fight it. And yet, here the Torah is essentially accommodating the Yetzer Hara within limits, within guidelines. Be it as it may, I'm not going to say that the Tosfos Rid is unanimously agreed to, but at least it is a very useful, helpful way of putting the Parsha into perspective. But it's interesting that I think a few years ago there was an IDF chaplain, a Rav in the army, who was just giving a Dvar Torah or something. So he wrote about, it happened to be this week's Parsha, so he wrote about the captive woman in time of war. But that's not a good choice for a military chaplain to write about, because some of his higher-ups thought he was advocating certain types of behaviors. So I believe he may have either he was removed from his position, or he was given some severe discipline and chastisement, because you don't write about this as if it's a halacha l'maisa that you're supposed to practice. But what I want to share with you is a very, very fascinating allegorical, metaphorical interpretation of the Or HaChaim HaKadosh, which is actually based on the Zohar. And again, obviously the Torah is talking about a specific context of a beautiful woman in time of war. That's what it's talking about. But here is what he says. Let's go back to the reading of the pasuk, allegorically. Ki Teitzei la milchama alo yavecha. When you go to wage war against your enemy, unesano Hashem elokecha biyadecha, Hashem will deliver the enemy into your hands. Vishavisa shivyo, and you will capture your captives. And then it says, and you will see in captivity a beautiful woman. So says the Or HaChaim, this is a remez to the greatest battle of our lives, the battle against our Yetzer Hara, the battle against our inclination to do sins and rebel against God. So what is the pasuk saying? When you decide to wage war against your enemy, when you decide that you're going to fight the Yetzer Hara, God will deliver your enemy into your hands. Never think the enemy is so powerful that you cannot defeat it. Hashem promises that if you sincerely commit to the battle, you will be given victory. Right? So that's the first meaning of the pasuk. When you go out to wage war against the enemy that seeks your destruction, and that's the Yetzer Hara, Hashem promises that He will deliver the Yetzer Hara into your hands. Now, it then goes on and says, and you see in captivity, meaning captured by the enemy, a beautiful woman, Eshet Yifat Toar. Says the Or HaChaim, says the Zohar, the beautiful woman is a remez to your own neshama. Your own neshama, your godly soul, is described as a beautiful woman. It is pure, it is pristine, it is filled with holiness and goodness. And sometimes it seems as if the evil inclination has captured my goodness. It's hijacked my neshama. I'm not able to exercise the goodness and the beauty of my neshama because it's hijacked. And you want to reclaim that neshama. You want to reclaim it. You want to get back to a place of goodness, a place of kedusha. So what do? So it's giving you, again, allegorically, it's giving you the steps that you take. So the first thing is, you shave off her hair, and you let her fingernails grow long. So says the Or HaChaim, based on the Zohar, that this is referring to the process of tshuva. I want to reclaim the beautiful neshama from the clutches of the Yetzer Hara and bring it back into the realm of kedusha. So what do? So he says the following. He says, a hair coming out of your head represents ideologies, ideas that are foreign to Torah. So shaving the hair means disabuse yourself of the false ideals and the incorrect ideologies that can lead a person astray, right? So that's the first step. Shave the hair, get rid of the, although I wouldn't put it this way, but the founding Rosh Hashiva of Or Sameach, Rav Mendel Weinbach, Zichrono Livracha, used to say, again, I wouldn't say it this way, but it's an interesting way of saying it. He says, people accuse the yeshivos of brainwashing their students. He says, what's wrong with a little brainwashing if the brain is filthy? If the brain is dirty, you got a dirty garment, you got to wash it. The brain is dirty, you got to wash it. Says brainwashing isn't so bad. Again, I wouldn't quite say it that way, but you hear the point. The point basically is that a lot of learning involves kind of knowing what not to accept, what is invalid, what is wrong, what is erroneous. So gilcha es chosha, shaving off the hair, meaning get rid of the false ideologies that corrupt us. It's a tough situation. I don't want to get into politics. Obviously, we're in a politically explosive time in Israel. But, you may have come across, I think I may have mentioned it last week as well, that recently there was a letter that was signed by 80 so-called Orthodox rabbis. Some of them were very, very left-wing. Some of them were actually respected Orthodox rabbis, condemning Israel's treatment of the civilians in Gaza. Basically siding with the leftist narrative that Israel was creating a humanitarian crisis in terms of not allowing supplies into Gaza. And this is very awful, and they were saying Jewish values are compassion and the like. Now, well, once again, if you look at the whole situation, it is very true that obviously Judaism values compassion, mercy, not inflicting suffering on people, and that includes towards non-Jewish people as well. But when you're in a war for survival and you're not targeting civilians, you're targeting military targets, you're targeting terrorists, and they happen to use, unfortunately, civilians as human shields, then you got to do what you have to do, simply because in the long run you will be saving more lives than, etc. So this would be an example where sometimes a person adopts maybe the values of a secular, liberal Western society, which are not really the values of the Torah in a given situation. Coming from a good heart, coming from good motives, but essentially it's a distorted view of reality based on a lack of moral clarity. Again, I don't want to get too political about this because people could very much differ with what I said as well. But nevertheless, the idea of shaving the hair is correct your thinking. Get rid of the false thoughts that sometimes can pervert a person's judgment. Okay, now, what about letting the fingernails grow very long? So this refers to another aspect of spiritual improvement. Our hands are what we grasp things with, right? We grasp things with our hands. When you have very long fingernails, it is difficult to grasp things. So this refers to the attachment to materialism and hedonistic pleasures. One of the things that can throw us off course in life are not just false ideologies, but an over-attachment to materialism and comfort. Now, our connection to materialism and comfort, which is referred to as gashmiut, right? Ruchniut is spirituality, gashmiut is physicality and materialism. Our connection to gashmiut is actually a fairly complicated connection because we are not ascetic. We do not preach poverty as a virtue. We do not tell people be poor, wear a hair shirt, lie down on a bed of nails. We recognize that a person needs and deserves a certain degree of comfort and material prosperity. But, once again, do you own your possessions or do your possessions own you? When a person becomes overly attached to money, to success, to material possessions, they can also ruin a person spiritually. This, by the way, at least in the United States, less so in Israel, is indeed a major spiritual crisis in specifically Orthodox communities. As the Orthodox communities in many areas of the United States have become affluent, you will see a tremendous connection to materialism. Gargantuan houses and $100,000 weddings and different types of luxuries and glatt kosher gourmet steakhouses, which you pay $200 per meal, etc. And people say, what's the problem? After all, it's glatt kosher and under the best hashgacha. Again, I don't mean to be fanatic here. I understand material pleasure too. But once again, it can distort a person's priorities. In fact, this is why people often say that it is better to grow up in the United States, grow up in out-of-town communities than in-town communities, like out-of-town, small towns, etc., smaller Jewish communities. And there are a lot of reasons. A lot of reasons. This is not the only reason. But one reason that's commonly given is that in the smaller communities, there is less emphasis on materialism and less emphasis on economic success, which can often be inimical, not necessarily to mitzvah observance. I'm not saying, the guy with the big house is not going to keep Shabbos. Baruch Hashem, he'll keep Shabbos. But it impairs spiritual sensitivity. It's more of an internal type of problem. So going back to the Orach Chaim, therefore, he says, you want to reclaim your neshama? So bring her home, bring her back to you. Shave the hair, correct the incorrect ideologies. Let the fingernails grow so you become less grasping in terms of a material world. And then let her cry for her father and her mother. So says the Zohar, her father is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When a person sins, they are bringing so much pain to Hashem, who loves us and is concerned with us. And when Hashem sees his children wandering away from him, it's a source of great pain to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So part of the tshuva is to cry over the pain that you brought to your father, Hashem, and your mother, the Jewish people as a whole. Remember we spoke 2 weeks ago about the principle, Kol Yisrael Areivin Zelazeh. Every Jew is responsible for another Jew. What one Jew does affects everybody. So, when I don't live in accordance with the Torah, I'm not just hurting myself. I'm hurting the Jewish people as a whole. And that's the mother, right? So Hashem is our father. Klal Yisrael is our mother. Crying over the father and mother is part of the tshuva process, is to understand that we betrayed our father, Hashem. We betrayed our mother. And finally it says, and she does this for a month of days. Says the Zohar, these are the 29 days of Elul, which are set aside for this crying, for this tshuva, for this tikkun, this rectification. And then the Torah says, at that point, you can take her for a wife, i.e., you become reunited to your neshama. So it's a very fascinating point, although obviously this is not the pashut pshat, this is not the simple meaning of the narrative. The narrative is referring to what it's referring to. But allegorically, it's a reference to reclaiming my soul through a process of introspective tshuva during the month of Elul, Yerach Yamim. The word Yerach, meaning a month, is actually not 30 days. Elul is not 30 days. Elul is only 29 days. But a Yerach is a lunar month which can refer to 29. It doesn't have to be 30 full days. So this is, again, a fascinating allegory. So now, though, I want to raise, I think, an interesting question about how to combine the allegory and the pshat. We know that there are different types of wars, right? There is in Judaism, in the halachic system, a law of milchama, a law of war. Among other things, war is a legitimation of homicide when it becomes necessary. Now, there are two types of wars that the Torah recognizes. One is called Milchemet Mitzvah, a war that is a mitzvah or an obligation to wage. Milchemet Mitzvah. The Rambam says there are 3 categories of Milchemet Mitzvah, 2 of which don't apply today, but I'll mention all 3. Category 1 is a war against the 7 indigenous nations that inhabited Canaan in the days of Yoshua bin Nun. The other is the war against the nation of Amalek. Now, those 2 really don't apply today in a literal sense because the 7 nations are extinct and Amalek as a nation cannot be identified. But then there's category 3, which unfortunately is very much with us, and that is a war of defense to defend the Jewish people against an enemy that tries to destroy us. Really, every war that Israel has fought since 1948 falls under the parameters of Milchemet Mitzvah because our wars have always been defensive, even when they have been preemptive. It was to disable an enemy that was planning to destroy us. The war of October 7, the war against Hamas, that we are still engaged in. Again, there's halachic discussion about this, but this, at least in its inception, was 100% a Milchemet Mitzvah. It was a war for the defense of the Jewish people against an enemy that wants to destroy us in an instant. This characterization is, again, I keep on swerving into politics, which I don't want to get into, but this is a primary text in the very, very controversial issue of the drafting of Charedim or the drafting of yeshiva students in the following way, that although there are military exemptions in time of war, the Talmud indicates that those exemptions only apply in optional wars, which I haven't defined that yet. But when it comes to Milchemet Mitzvah, there is no such thing as an exemption. Everyone can be obligated to fight in what is called a Milchemet Mitzvah. So you see where that leads you. That leads you to this contention that if indeed the struggle that we are engaged in qualifies as Milchemet Mitzvah, at that point, there's no automatic exemption. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have 100% conscription. No army ever conscripts 100% of the, even the eligible population. But it does mean that there's no entitlement to an exemption if there's a military need for a larger base of conscription. This would actually be the halachic argument that would argue in favor of conscription of Charedim and yeshiva students, etc., simply because once it's a Milchemet Mitzvah, there are no exemptions. The counter-argument is, some say that even a defensive war may not be a Milchemet Mitzvah unless there's a duly constituted Melech, and Netanyahu is not yet a Melech, although he's kind of moving in that direction. Others want to argue that the exemption for people who study Torah is a super exemption that even applies in Milchemet Mitzvah based on a strange reading of the Rambam. I do not want to get into this issue, and I also want to point out that even if you accept that students of Torah should be exempt, that doesn't automatically translate to a Haredi exemption. If someone is not learning in yeshiva, people are combining 2 different issues. The issue of Torah students and the issue of Haredim in the army are 2 separate issues, and one has nothing to do with the other. Again, I don't want to talk about that. There's a lot to talk about, and whatever I say will be attacked. I will just mention, just as an aside, forgive me for being too political, that just within the past few weeks, there were 3 leading, very, very chashuv Haredi rabbis who actually supported the drafting of Haredim who are not actively involved in full-time yeshiva learning. Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein, Rabbi Yashiv son-in-law, is a very, very chashuv Talmud Chacham, Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef, the Sephardic chief rabbi, and the third person, also a Sephardi. On the other hand, somewhat astoundingly, I just saw a letter from Rabbi Victor Nevensal, who is the Rav of the Old City, the Eratika, very eminent Talmud Chacham, who I believe, because he actually comes from a religious Zionist family, that he actually served in the army at some point in his life, but he signed a letter saying that even a Haredi not in yeshiva is not allowed to enlist in the IDF. Who knows? That's very inexplicable, but this is the letter. It may be forged. This is the other thing. This is the other thing that, unfortunately, we live in a culture where people's signatures are forged all the time, and even signed letters cannot necessarily be trusted. Again, I'm not going to talk about this other than what I said, but that's milchemet mitzvah, a mitzvah war. Now, there's a second category of war that in a way is somewhat enigmatic, and that is optional wars. There are wars that the Jewish people are allowed to wage, but they're not mitzvah wars. Now, one second here. What type of war would you be allowed to wage that wouldn't be a mitzvah war? It could only be an aggressive war of offense. Because if it's a war of defense, that's the third example of milchemet mitzvah. So what's milchemet reshut? A war of aggression. Huh? Are you telling me that halacha permits the state of Israel to simply wage a non-defensive war of aggression to get territory? That sounds barbaric. That sounds like Saddam Hussein, taking over Kuwait because he wanted the oil. So rest assured that although the word milchemet reshut does mean optional war, and it includes wars of aggression, but there are certain requirements for milchemet reshut that make it impossible today. Number one, you need a Sanhedrin to authorize it. And number two, you need prophetic authorization through the Urim V'Tumim, the Kohen Gadol's breastplate. In other words, God has to give you permission for whatever reason, which means without specific divine authorization, milchemet reshut is impossible. To put it another way, the only legitimate war that a Jewish state is allowed to fight halachically is a war of defense. And indeed, the state of Israel, every single war of the state of Israel can very easily be characterized as a war of defense. Now, obviously, a war of defense, you understand this, is also going to be offensive. Meaning a war of defense is not just using the Iron Dome to repel missiles. It also involves going after the enemy aggressively. So obviously, a defensive war involves a certain degree of offensive operation, but if the goal of the war is not territory or self-aggrandizement, the goal of the war is to disable an enemy that is trying to destroy us, that is a milchemet mitzvah that does not require prophetic authorization. Milchemet reshut, in other words, cannot be fought today. Today, there is no legitimate heter for milchemet reshut, because you need Sanhedrin and you need Urim V'Tumim. Okay, that's a little bit of an introduction in terms of terminology, and I alluded to the impact of these distinctions on the modern conflicts that we are still going through. But now, let's go back to Eshet Shafat Torah. When the Torah describes the Eshet Shafat Torah and the beautiful woman in time of war, what type of war is the Torah talking about? Is the Torah describing milchemet mitzvah, or is the Torah describing milchemet reshut? What is the war that this narrative is talking about? So Rashi says, based on the Sifri, that the Torah is talking about milchemet reshut, which we couldn't do today, not milchemet mitzvah, because since the Torah says you have captives of war, at least when you're waging war against Amalek or the 7 nations, there are no captives. They have to be obliterated. So therefore, by definition, we're talking about milchemet reshut. Now, the truth of the matter is, again, there are technicalities here. It's hard to know the proof here, because I understand that Yifat Torah cannot be talking about the Amalek war or the 7 nations, because there you have to obliterate. But why do you then say it has to be talking about milchemet reshut? Maybe it's talking about a milchemet mitzvah like we're waging now, a defensive war, in which you are allowed to take prisoners of war, and Yifat Torah might apply there. Meaning, why do you rule that out? It's a good question. In other words, the proof that Rashi brings to rule out Milchemet Mitzvah is only a good proof for 2 out of the 3 categories. It rules out Amalek, and it rules out the 7 nations because there are no casualties. There are no prisoners that you take, but it doesn't rule out defensive wars. Nevertheless, although the proof that Rashi and Chazal bring is a problematic proof, the bottom line is nonetheless the case that Yifat Torah only applies to optional wars. It does not apply to mitzvah wars. In truth, I'm not sure why the military chaplain didn't use that at his defense. When he wrote about Yifat Torah, and he was criticized by his supervisors for legitimating that practice today, his answer could have been very pashut. No. This practice is only permitted for optional wars, and the state of Israel is engaged in mitzvah wars, so I was not advocating Yifat Torah because it doesn't apply to the wars that we're engaged in. If I would have been his lawyer, his military lawyer, I would have raised that as proof that he was not advocating anything that was improper. Okay. Now, given that reality, that the war of the Yifat Torah is optional war and not mitzvah war, the question is, how do you merge that pshat with the allegory of the process of tshuva? For example, if I were to ask you, using the vocabulary of war, would I describe the war against the Yetzer Hara as a mitzvah war or an optional war? How would I describe that war? It's a davar pashut that the war against the Yetzer Hara is certainly a mitzvah war. It's not an optional war. In fact, that is the mitzvah of my life. The mitzvah of my life is to wage war against the Yetzer Hara. So the question would be, why would the Torah give us an allegory of waging war against the Yetzer Hara in a Parsha that is talking about optional wars, if the war against the Yetzer Hara is a mitzvah war? It's in the wrong place. Maybe you should have put it with Amalek. When we talk about killing Amalek, be meramez to killing the Yetzer Hara, fighting the Yetzer Hara. Put it in that there. Why are you putting the war of the Yetzer Hara in a Parsha that's Milchemet Rishut and not Milchemet Mitzvah? Meaning, there seems to be a disconnect between the pshat of the pasuk and the allegory because they don't match. One is optional war, one is mitzvah war. So the answer must be that what the Torah is teaching us is something very profound, that even though the war of the Yetzer Hara is a mitzvah war, but you don't fight it like a mitzvah war, you fight it like an optional war, meaning the techniques of the battle are to mirror the optional war and not the mitzvah war. How so? What do I mean by that? As I indicated, one of the major differences between the mitzvah war and the optional war is that in the mitzvah war, now not defensive wars, I'm not referring to our mitzvah war, but in the war of Amalek and the 7 nations, there are no captives. The enemy must be wiped out entirely. Amalek must be destroyed. The 7 nations must be destroyed. Meaning there are no captives. In optional wars, obviously, we do take captives. We don't kill unnecessarily. So the suggestion basically is that in the process of tshuva, there are 2 ways a person might correct their life and might change their life. Rav Soloveitchik talks about this. He talks about the tshuva of amputation versus the tshuva of transformation. Let's imagine a person lived many years of a life without Torah. No Shabbos, no kashrus, maybe not even belief in God. And now, at the age of 20, 25, 30, or older, they decide to change their lives. They decide to become a new person. And Baruch Hashem, God accepts that tshuva, and they're now a good, fine, religious, spiritual, holy Jew. But what do you do with the 20 or 30 years in which you were not living that way. And let's say it was worse than simply not being religious. Let's assume there were years of drug abuse, alcoholism, real sins, gilei arayot. What do you do with the 30 years? So there are two ways psychologically that a person approaches that situation. One is to simply try to amputate that past. I forget about that past. That's not me anymore. I'm a new person. I forget about that. I sever my contacts. I am born today. My birthday is the day that I turned over a new leaf. Sometimes that is necessary. Sometimes a past may be so toxic and so degenerate, and the relationships were so destructive, that the only thing you can do is amputate. But you have to understand that amputation, just as in medical amputation, is a last resort, not a first resort. Amputation sometimes may be necessary, but it always has a very significant cost. You lose an arm. There is phantom pain, which can be excruciating. You're not whole. Those years, and spiritually, those years become a waste. You've lost 30 years. There is, however, a deeper way that you can deal with those 30 years. It's not that you kill them or you amputate them, but the very struggles of the past become the key to your identity in serving God. You don't forget where you came from. You draw on those experiences in forming the uniqueness of your identity. I mean, let me give you a simple example. Let's say a person was a drug addict for 20 years. And finally they went through the extreme difficult job of kicking the habit. Now, one way of going on in life is I simply forget that part of my life. I disconnect myself from that part of my life. I kill it off. You're left with amputation, and you're left with empty time. But what if a person becomes, let's say, a drug or alcohol counselor and is able to help people precisely because of the negative experiences that they had that give them empathy and insight? That's a very different type of process. You're not cutting off the past. You're reclaiming the past and using it as your source of strength to be able to serve God in such a way that you would not have been able to serve God had you not gone through that negative experience. That is not the tshuva of amputation. That is the tshuva of reclamation. So, in a Milchemes mitzvah, the enemy is obliterated and destroyed. In Milchemet Reshut, the enemy is captured and subjugated. What the Torah is teaching you is, there's one type of Milchemet mitzvah where the enemy is to be subjugated rather than destroyed. And that is the war of the Yetzer Hara. Take your past and let it be the source of your strength and your insight. Now this is a very important idea. Obviously most of our students in Or Sameach are Chozrei B'Tshuva. They come from non-religious environments. And they come to Yiddishkeit, whatever, in their 20s or even older. And it's very easy to have a certain inferiority complex because they go to these houses of people that are 10th generation Yerushalmis. And the kids, I have that inferiority complex as well. And, on a good day, I can speak Hebrew as good as the sixth grader in the house. And you wonder, when will I catch up? When will they have such a head start on me. It's not even fair. God put me, because remember, God put us in these different environments. God put us in South Dakota or whatever it would be. It's not fair. Why was I put in an environment in which I can never really catch up to the people that were born in a religious environment? But the answer is, this is the secret. It's true that the 10th generation Mei Yesharim has gifts and experiences and backgrounds that I will never have. But it's also true that the person that grew up on a farm in South Dakota has experiences and insights that the 10th generation Mei Yesharim person doesn't have. And God did not give you these experiences so you should ignore them and try to be somebody else. God gave you these experiences so you draw upon them and they become the source of your strength. It is not the tshuva of amputation, it is the tshuva of reclamation. I take that past, I convert it from a negative to a positive. It forms who I am. That's why a person who is new to Judaism should not necessarily be discouraged from discarding their past friendships, their past talents, their past interests. That can often result in a phantom pain and at least a low level, sometimes a high level of depression. Rather, you take what you have and that becomes the foundation of your life. Because once again, that was part of Hashem's plan. Part of Hashem's plan was to put you in the environments you were in. You see? So that's the wisdom, the amazing wisdom, that you fight the Milchemes Mitzvah of the Yetzer Hara the way you fight a Milchemet Reshut, not the way you fight a Milchemet Mitzvah. Many of you might remember the great Rosh Hashiva of Mir, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, Zichrono Livracha. It's been has it been 10 years already? It's been a while since he was nifter. And a man of tremendous courage, a man who suffered disease for many, many years, shaking uncontrollably, but didn't even want to take medication because he felt it clouded his thinking. And he managed not only to teach Torah, but to really keep the Mir Yeshiva open with thousands and thousands and thousands of students, traveling all over the world, always with simcha, sever panim yafos, loving his students. So his story is very interesting. He's not a Baal Tshuva. He grew up in a very religious family, in fact, a family that was very connected to the Mir Yeshiva. But he grew up in a bit of a more modern environment. He grew up in Chicago. He went to co-ed high schools. He was on the basketball team. He was on the debating team. All sorts of things that we would not associate with a Haredi Rosh Yeshiva of the great Mir Yeshiva. So here's the thing. I remember when he was nifter and I went to the Levaya. So all of the eulogies were making the same theme about, you see that even if a person comes from the worst type of negative environment, an environment that's totally without holiness and totally without value, they are able to escape their environment and they can become holy and kadosh and noble. And the whole point was, he came from nothing, he came from garbage, he came from filth, but he escaped it. And that's the greatness of Nosson Tzvi Finkel, that he escaped a degenerate, worthless environment. Now, since I grew up in somewhat of a similar environment, so I was a little insulted. I don't remember. I went to a co-ed school. I don't remember it as like such a bad, evil, worthless place. I thought there was a lot of good in it. Avas Yisrael and Achdus and unity, and we got to, wasn't as maybe ultra-Orthodox as we would like. And the truth of the matter is, the greatness of the Rosh Hashiva, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, was not that he escaped his environment. He used his environment all the time. Precisely because he went to a co-ed school and he played on the basketball team and he watched television and he knew Beverly Hillbillies, whatever it was. He was able to relate to American kids in a way that few Rosh Yeshivas were able to. So kids would come from the United States from co-ed, modern Orthodox high schools. And they would go to Mir, which was a totally different world. And they would see this Rosh Yeshiva dressed all in black. And Bechlal, it was hard to talk to him. It was a little scary because he was shaking. And then he would start talking about jump shots and debate teams and television. Huh?
Rabbi Finkel, the Shimon, was a man, when he died, he was like 80-something. I mean, he's our generation.
Yeah.
Most of us went, myself included, to co-ed.
That's correct. That is correct. Yeah.
I mean, I was invited to the boys' bar mitzvah parties when I was in seventh
Yeah.
But I was not allowed to dance with boys, so I was one of the only girls there that just...
Right.
But we were allowed to go, and that didn't mean we came from terrible backgrounds.
Yeah, I understand that, but the point I'm making is that things get redefined and recharacterized today, right?
Misdefined.
Yeah, I agree. So my point was that Rav Finkel did not escape his background. He took his background, and that became the key to his success in connecting to people of all different backgrounds. Now, I know another Rosh Yeshiva. I'm not going to mention names, obviously. Well, I actually don't know the Rosh Yeshiva. I know his sister. And his sister calls me up every once in a while to complain about her brother. Her brother is a very eminent person who, as the sister describes it, came from a very modern Orthodox place where co-ed and everything else, but now, well, the way she describes it, pretends that never existed. She complains that when their mother came to make Aliyat, her name was Zahava. He changed it to Golda because Zahava is too Zionistic, whatever it would be, and whatever. So she says, he is denying his heritage. He is making believe that he didn't have this life when in fact he had this life. Okay, there are reasons for that too. I don't want to get into, I'm getting into too many controversial issues. But the point I want to make is that Rav Finkel never, ever, ever denied where he came from, and he never disparaged where he came from. He recognized its strengths. He recognized its milas. And what he did was he took the good parts of that environment, Chicago in particular, if you know the Midwest. I lived in Chicago for 4 years. Friendly place, open place. He took those qualities. He brought it to his Yiddishkeit. And that is the tshuva of reclamation. That's the tshuva of milchemet reshut, not the tshuva of milchemet mitzvah. So that's what we have to do as well, to kind of celebrate our lives and use all of our experiences in building our unique relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Thank you.
Good.